Okay, everyone, here we are. This is part 2 of Kevin's talk about the Proto Indo-Europeans. This time around, he and I will be having a looser conversation about the Proto Indo-Europeans. So if you came over from the last talk, welcome back again. If this is for some reason your very first talk of the day, we'll do approximately 20 minutes of a conversation, 20 minutes for Q&A. You can use the Ask a Question button that is at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. You can send them in at any time, and we'll address them at the end of this. So Kevin just wanted to wrap up one loose end from the previous talk.
First thing I would say is you might want to remind, I almost forgot to switch over to the panel. I was staying at the same location, so there might still be people hanging out there that need to be prompted to remember to switch over to this channel. Yeah, at any rate,
looks like the folks are
figuring it out.
They're coming in, yeah.
Okay. I was going to say that I was reading the comments on the sideboard when we were done, and someone made a comment about, I held up this earlier showing Platypus from Greek, giving us the word plateau, and someone say it reminded me of the word platypus. And I should mention that platypus is that root word platus, meaning foot, and pus is the Greek version of ped, so it means foot. So platypus is literally flat-footed, and in the word platypus, you can hear the p's in Greek, whereas English would say the same thing, flat-footed. Those are just the English versions of the same words with the F sound at the beginning. So I just thought that was interesting.
Okay, fantastic. So Kevin, I guess I'll just sort of set a framework for our conversation. I'll set us up, and then we can sort of improvise. So the main question that I'm interested in, and perhaps I should preface this by saying that one of the ways that I got into studying the Proto Indo-Europeans was through Kevin's podcast. I don't know if you know that, Kevin, but back in 2013, something like that. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Is that when you started? Yeah,
2012.
Yeah. So I had done some, preliminary independent research on the Proto Indo-Europeans. Found it really fascinating. Found the History of English podcast, and I said, "Oh, this is totally fantastic." And it just raised this question, why don't more people know about the Proto Indo-Europeans? Why isn't their story widely told? And now if you're here, I'm just going to assume that you have some sense of who the Proto Indo-Europeans are. And the Indo-European language family is the largest language family spoken in the world today. I think it's something like 3.2, 3.3 billion native speakers. And that's something like half of the world's population. And we, as English speakers, everyone here at this conference, probably many, if not most of your friends and family, are all English speakers. And we are the direct linguistic heirs to this prehistoric group of people, the Proto Indo-Europeans. Which is not to be confused with being their ethnic heirs, which is something that we'll talk about soon. So this fact alone, that a several thousand-year-old group of people that were originally confined to, not a small geographical region, but a relatively small geographical region, given the modern distribution of Indo-European languages, that very fact that this ancient group of people directly is impacting almost all of the words that I'm using right now to talk to you is fundamentally fascinating and profound to me. And that fact would seem to make them like one of the most important people to ever walk the earth. And yet most people outside of very specialized academia have never even heard of the Proto Indo-Europeans. And if they have a vague sense of who they were. And I would include myself in that latter category before I took on this independent research of my own. So the question is why? And I just want to read a very quick paragraph. It's actually the first paragraph of yet another classic resource on Proto-Indo-European studies, In Search of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. It was published about 30 years ago, so some of the scholarship has been updated, but the general presentation and premises still hold up. So let me just read this first paragraph. By the 1st century AD, historical records reveal peoples settled from the shores of the Atlantic to India, all speaking languages closely related to one another. These are the Indo-European languages whose origins can be traced back to a common ancestor that was spoken in Eurasia some 6,000 years ago. We call the people who spoke this ancestral language the Indo-Europeans or Proto Indo-Europeans. But although we can give them a name, they are unlike almost any other ancient people we are likely to encounter. As the linguistic ancestors of nearly half this planet's population, they are one of the most important entities in the prehistoric record, and yet they are also one of the most elusive. No Proto-Indo-European text exists. Their physical remains and material culture cannot be identified without extensive argument, and their geographical location has been the subject of a century and a half of intense yet inconclusive debate. We've gotten a bit more conclusive on that last point, but I think this paragraph sort of implicitly answers the question, why don't we know more about them? And so I have several ideas just taken from this. And they don't fit into the way that we teach history. The Proto-Indo-Europeans don't fit into, say, like a great man approach to history, where we follow the achievements of leaders, or at the very least, we follow people and what they did. But we don't know a single Proto-Indo-European by name. We don't know specifically what any one Proto-Indo-European did. So we can toss that one out. We also study civilizations. Well, the Proto-Indo-Europeans did not have a civilization. They were pastoralists that moved around. We don't have buildings from them. And the archaeology that we do have is sparse and, as already stated, inconclusive. How else do we study history? We also study literature, the writings of a people. And although the Proto-Indo-Europeans gave us their language, they lived before the invention of any written script. So they have not left us texts that we can read. So what that means is, in order to tell the Proto-Indo-European story, not only do we need to rely on very specialized fields of academia, including linguistics, archaeology, ancient history, which also includes religion and mythology, but we need to synthesize all of these fields into a coherent story. And quite simply, that's hard to do. You need to understand a lot in order to distill it into a coherent narrative. But I really wish more teachers, writers, scholars stepped up to do that task, because I just think that their story is fundamentally interesting. And another thing that makes the story hard to reconstruct is that much of what we know is hypothetical, as Kevin indicated in the previous talk. But one thing that is not hypothetical is DNA evidence, which there has been some light shed on Proto-Indo-European DNA. And I know Kevin has something to say about this, so I'll stop talking and pass it on to him.
You're good. You're doing great. I agree with everything you said. I think the one thing I would add is, and this is just a different aspect of what you just said, but one of the reasons why the knowledge of of the original Indo-Europeans is not widely spread, widely known, is because it was so uncertain. It was the subject of so much debate and argument, and almost anything you could say about the Proto-Indo-Europeans you would get into almost fisticuffs over it at one time. And with that being the case, how do you teach that in schools? How do you teach that as history? And I think, as I noted earlier, over the past few decades, there's starting to be a consensus as to who these people were. We no longer think of it as just a linguistic concept. We can now associate it with a specific group of people, the Yamnaya people who lived north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And I think that's going to allow this to become a more documented, historical development. And maybe over time, more people will learn about it as it becomes more generally accepted. I noted in the podcast, I noted in my presentation earlier, and also in the podcast, that there is one main competing theory, and that is the fact, or the argument, that the Indo-Europeans lived south of the Black Sea at a much earlier date. And let me kind of give you the argument for that. I said I was done with my handouts, but I'm not. This is a map of the world, of Eurasia. We're basically talking about this area right up here, north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. But there are people who believe very strongly that the Indo-Europeans lived down here in what is modern-day Turkey. And they believe that they lived there about 6 or 7,000 BCE, as opposed to 3 or 4,000 BCE. So a few thousand years earlier, and they migrated here through the Balkans into Europe, and then maybe migrated that way down into India. The argument for that was based on the fact that that's when agriculture spread into Europe. Prior to that date, Europe was populated, very sparsely populated, but populated by hunter-gatherers. And around that time, around 6 or 7,000 BC, farmers emerged out of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, moved up through the Balkans into Europe, and established farming, fixed settlements for the first time. And it was thought that they must have brought the Indo-European language with them. Again, the linguistic evidence, though, pointed more to north of the Black Sea, where you had wheeled wagons were common, the geographical features. I won't cover all this in the podcast, but so that created part of the discrepancy. Recent DNA studies have helped to explain this. And these studies were conducted 2015, 2016. So they've all been done since I talked about the Indo-Europeans in my podcast. And what the DNA evidence tends to indicate is that, in fact, yes, the DNA of ancient hunter-gatherers that have been, the bodies that have been unearthed, the bones that have been tested, show that they're completely different DNA than the farmers that came up from Turkey, Anatolia, around 6 or 7,000 BC, maybe a little more recent than that. But eventually what happened is they displaced the hunter-gatherers, and their DNA became the dominant DNA in Europe for a while. But then about within the time frame of the Yamnaya people, so around 3,000 or so BCE, there was another massive migration, the DNA shows, out of the steppe region into Europe. And also there's a similar migration going into India as well. And that migration was established in this DNA study that tested 69 skeletons of ancient people, both Yamnaya people that have been discovered and other people in Europe. And of those 60, I think there were 9 from the Yamnaya culture and 4 from the corded ware culture, which was a culture in northern Europe, north of the steppe where the Yamnaya lived. And what it showed was that 75% of the DNA in the corded ware region was replaced with Yamnaya DNA. So that was a significant development. And there was a similar transition that occurred in Western Europe. I'm looking over at my notes here. Skeletons that have been tested in Europe itself show that 90% of the earlier population in Britain, say that again, in Britain, 90% of the DNA was replaced with people that had Yamnaya ancestry. And so, or people that carried some genetic trace. Okay, they weren't pure Yamnaya, but they carried some genetic trace of Yamnaya people. And this is very important because there is this distinction between genetics and language. It's very important because languages are not necessarily tied to genetics. People learn languages of all races and ethnicities, and languages spread, not necessarily due to migration or conquest, but people just learn languages, dominant cultural languages. It's what's happening to English today. So just because the Indo-European languages spread throughout Europe and South Asia doesn't mean there was necessarily a conquest. People could have just learned that language. But the DNA evidence is suggesting that there was a significant movement of people. And now, does that mean they were conquered? That the Yamnaya? Well, the Yamnaya were pretty fierce people. Apparently, they were. A lot of the words in their language point to a pretty fierce culture. But there's also another factor here that's fascinating and very apropos given where we are today, and it has to do with plague. Scholars looking at DNA think that one of the reasons why the Yamnaya people spread so far, so fast, is they carried plague with them. And if we go back to the 1300s, we have the Black Death that ravaged Europe, that killed about a third of the population, some places nearly half the population. Well, as I talked about in the podcast, when I talked about it, the plague, that plague began in Eurasia. And it spread through trading networks into Europe. Well, it appears that what happened in Europe is the first wave of the plague was devastating. People who were susceptible to it died out. People who were better able to fight it, who had some resistance to it, survived. So they passed on that genetic trait. So when the plague came back around a few years later, it killed a lot of people, but not as many. And then it came back again and again and again, and it killed fewer people each time on average. What happened is people, established a certain degree of resistance to it. And what some modern scholars think happened is this same plague, same fleas, or that same bacterium, existed in the Eurasian steppe for centuries, and that the Yamnaya people had built up a certain resistance to it. And when they spread into Central Europe, they carried those fleas and that same bacterium with them. And there's actually evidence of that in some of the DNA, where some of the bones of the bodies that have been discovered have evidence of that plague bacterium in their teeth, which shows they probably died from it. And so that may have been a major factor in the spread of Indo-Europeans, or the Yamnaya people, is they just carried disease and plague with them. And it didn't necessarily murder and kill everybody, but the populations died out, leaving a lot of Yamnaya left over. I will mention one last comment on that. In the podcast, I'm getting ready to get to the age of exploration. So we'll deal with the European colonialization of North and South America. And we usually think of that in political terms. But if we think about it in linguistic terms, it's really just a later day Indo-European migration, because now most of North and South America speak an Indo-European language. And it was essentially the same process repeating itself all over again, if that's what happened originally, because as you probably know, a lot of Native Americans died out simply due to disease that Europeans brought with them. So there is this connection apparently between disease and linguistic spread that recurs throughout history.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point. I mean, I was thinking about this actually as you were speaking. Someone in Brazil, someone in Afghanistan, and someone in Albania all speak, like if you're speaking the native languages of those, or I should say the standardized languages of those countries, because native is native implies something else that implies an indigenous language, and Indo-European languages actually displaced the native languages of these regions, countries, and states. But today, by and large, if you are born in Brazil, if you're born in Afghanistan, if you're born in Albania, if you're born in England, you speak an Indo-European language. And the people from those different countries probably have little ethnically in common. So, yeah, I think that covers half of why the I'm sorry.
I was going to say, and maybe this is what you're leading to, but this gets into a very dark area, as if talking about plague and Black Death was.
I think I'm going there.
Go ahead, go there. I know where you're going.
Well, I was going to say that the second main reason that the Proto Indo-European story is not well known to the public is because for much of its history, the scholarship has been co-opted by dubious and pseudoscientific nationalist agendas, most famously the Aryan race during World War II. So Indo-European scholarship has a pretty unflattering history. So let me, I have a lot to say about this, Kevin. You can interrupt me at any point and say what you want to say. So yes, the Indo-Europeans are responsible for the myth of the Aryan race, and yes, it is a myth. But before we talk about that, what does that word Aryan mean? We've heard it in the context of Aryan race, and we think some like superior, light-skinned, tall, blonde, blue-eyed people. but the word actually has a much older origin than that. So Aryan is a word originally found in the Indo-Iranian languages. And quick crash course, the Indo-Europeans who would eventually migrate to modern-day Iran and India were once part of a single group that then fractured off. So those two groups are actually very closely related linguistically and genetically. And in the ancient Iranian religious scriptures called the Avesta scriptures, they were part of the Zoroastrian religion of ancient Persia. In those texts, we find a people that call themselves the Aryans. And Aryan is actually the etymological root word of Iran. So that's in Iran. And now in ancient India, in the Rig Veda, which are the foundational scriptures of ancient Hinduism, Aryan is used as a religious designation for those Indo-European peoples living in India. And I can't recall it off the top of my head, but there's actually an ancient Sanskrit word for India that has the word Aryan in it. If someone knows, they can drop it in the, if anyone is a Sanskrit scholar here in the audience, you can drop it in the chat. So that's where we get this word from. And if we disassociate that word from the ethnic connotations, it was simply a word, an Indo-Iranian word that meant noble, excellent, or great. So these people applied that word to themselves as a people, as an ethnicity, as a religious group, etc. So that raises the question, why in the world were religious and ethnic terms from ancient India and Iran co-opted by Nazis during World War II as the basis of a superior white, blonde, blue-eyed race? And yeah, so before the term Indo-European emerged, Aryan was the primary term used. And that's because during the 19th century, when historical linguistics was getting underway, with particular momentum in Germany, the ancient Iranian language was the oldest attested Indo-European language. And like I said, those people called themselves the Aryans. So because at that time, that was the oldest extant Indo-European language, 19th century European intellectuals made the mistake of thinking that these Aryans were actually very close to being the Proto Indo-Europeans themselves. So they got this idea that the Aryans were a pure, unmixed race, that over the thousands of years of migrations, invasions, and so forth, that they became ethnically diluted, and that somehow the Germanic peoples were the direct ethnic descendants of this original race of peoples. And there was, these scholars were citing support for this in ancient Roman authors like Caesar and Tacitus, who upon their first contact with Germans, they described them as a pure race. But as scholars know today, that Romans the ancient Roman historians were not the best ethnographers and anthropologists. So there are a ton of problems with linking the Indo-European language to a race of people, which I think we've already demonstrated. But in the 19th century, scholars working in the field of historical linguistics didn't know that. Apparently that wasn't clearly obvious. So you have Western European anthropologists and linguists sort of working together to fuel this this scholarship that's describing German racial superiority, or I should say Germanic racial superiority, based on this notion of the Aryan race, which again ultimately has its links to the Indo-European discovery. And I can't really speak much to the anthropology scholarship. I know that there were some ways of like measuring the skulls of Germanic populations and comparing them to other Europeans and other races, and somehow that indicated some superior mental fitness. This is all pseudoscience that was taken very seriously at the time. But one way that the linguists used the reconstructed Proto Indo-European language to support this notion of a superior race was they said, look at how sophisticated the Indo-European languages are. And the Indo-European languages are what we call inflected languages. That means that we can modify words to reflect things like tense, plurality, sing, sang, sung. These are all the same word with a vowel modification. Run, runs, running. We're adding different suffixes. So these Western European scholars said, hey, look how sophisticated this language is. And then they compared this to other non-inflected languages of the world. So for example, Chinese is what we call an analytic language, where we don't add these little suffixes or modify words. Things like tense, plurality, aspect, etc. These are determined by word order, just moving around words. So these scholars said that's a very simplistic language. That's not very advanced. And these Proto Indo-Europeans perfected their language. And maybe Kevin, you can speak to this, that the notion of perfecting a language is, one, absurd, and two, that's not actually what the Proto Indo-Europeans were doing on the Eurasian steppe. They weren't sitting around like meditating and perfecting their language.
No, I mean, I think you nailed it. That's, as I noted in the podcast, a lot of the early research, as it just happened to turn out, was in the realm of Proto Indo-European studies, was done by German linguists. And as I noted in the podcast, those sound changes are generally known today as Grimm's Law, associated with Jacob Grimm of Brothers Grimm fame, because he helped to identify the specific sound changes that occurred within the Germanic languages. But there were many other linguists in Germany and Austria in that region early on. In fact, the vast majority of the research was done there. And that fed into it as well. It was partly had to do with German identity and establishing the idea that in the past there was a pure Germanic people with a pure Germanic language, and it gave the German nation the right to recapture those territories and bring them back in and unify the German peoples. The problem with all of that, of course, is it's just not based in reality. And in fact, the DNA evidence really points to how flawed of a concept that was, because the Yamnaya people themselves were not pure race. The same study that I mentioned, the Yamnaya who lived up here that we think were the Proto Indo-Europeans, their DNA shows that about half of their population were native herdsmen of that region. The other half of their DNA apparently comes from south of the Caucasus region, that the tribes moved across, and that's very unusual to move between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So their DNA was mixed from the very beginning, two different groups. And then as they moved into the corded ware communities, they mixed further, and then they continued to mix. So even though the DNA evidence shows the expansion of DNA, people carrying strains of that DNA, there were no pure-blooded people. There have always been mixtures of people. And as I noted in the first part of my discussion earlier, the language itself was never pure. Proto-Indo-European, we think of it today as one thing. It's just a collection of related dialects. So any notion of purity has always been ridiculous, but it did have its moment, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, the only way that you can make a purity argument is if you cut off historically, like before a certain point, right? Like if you say, okay, before 3000 BCE, if we ignore all of this, now it's pure because, we're not looking behind the curtain. Or if you say, okay, we're only going to look at the genetic evidence from 500 CE and then ignore everything else. And if we start from that point, then we have a basis for purity. But, for all intents and purposes, I hate that expression, but truly for all intents and purposes, unless we're to infinitely regress to the beginning of time where there is, the emergence of people, that people have always been intermingling.
And we should note, too, that the studies of Indo-European languages began in conjunction and around the same time as Charles Darwin was, proposing the theory of evolution, which had as one of its basic ideas the idea of survival of the fittest. And that got wrapped up into all of this as well. And it's part of the reason, arguably, why we have family trees of languages, may be pulled in part from some of that as well. But the idea that there was this, if Indo-Europeans spread their language across such a vast population, then they must have just been genetically superior. And again, these were the notions that kind of got mixed together way, way, way beyond anything that linguists were saying, or even geneticists were saying, early geneticists, into the realm of pseudoscience. And, people twisting and manipulating the facts to promote whatever harebrained political theories they have, and that still happens today. But it just pointed to the danger of the way in which so much of this information could be misused and was misused, and it's something that we still have to be careful about today. I know that the study that I mentioned earlier, this DNA study, David Reich was a professor at Harvard who helped put that study together, one of the contributors, and I read his book recently. I was familiar with the study, but then I read his book about it, and he mentioned how just the idea that the DNA showed a spread of a genetic population carrying language freaked out some of the German scholars that were contributing to the study, one of whom resigned, just because just the way in which that type of information had been misused in the past. He did not even want to be associated with a DNA study that might show something similar. Again, even though what the DNA study shows is just genetic traits. But again, it just shows you how controversial and how even potentially dangerous this topic can be if it's not handled properly, because there are always going to be people out there that are going to try to twist it and misuse it. And my only advice to anyone listening to this is be very wary of that. If you hear someone trying, because I will guarantee you there are people right now as we're speaking somewhere on the internet espousing these same theories. Just understand, language is language, DNA is DNA. There are times when the two may overlap a bit, but they're not the same thing.
Yeah. All right, maybe we should turn to questions. One quick thing. Damon pointed out, I mentioned earlier that there is a Sanskrit word for India itself, including the word Arya, and it's Aryavarta. That is the word that I mentioned. Thank you for whoever looked that up. Okay, we went way over time with our talk. Hopefully everyone enjoyed that. So here are the questions. Question 1. Are there any links between Proto Indo-European and Magyar, or did Magyar remain totally undiluted by Proto Indo-European? If so, do you have any thoughts on why that happened, given that they're pretty close geographically? I, quite frankly, don't know.
Magyar is generally categorized as part of the Uralic language family,
right,
which is a separate language family, but many linguists believe it to be related to the Proto Indo-European language family. It also includes within it Finnish and a few other languages. I can't recall all of them.
Hungarian.
Well, Magyar is Hungarian.
Right. Yeah.
And so it appears, I think my understanding, I haven't studied Magyar enough to really be able to speak definitively about it, but my understanding is that it is believed to be tied perhaps to Eurasian tribes like the Huns, but other groups as well who came into Europe during earlier periods of invasions and brought Eurasian languages with them and may be tied to that. But it's not an Indo-European language, nor is the Mongolian languages. The Turkish language, which also has origins in Eurasia, is not an Indo-European language. But again, there are scholars who advocate for what's called a Eurasian language family, a greater Eurasian language family, and they would put the Mongolian languages, Turkish languages, Proto-Indo-European, and the Uralic languages all together within this larger family that originated in the steppe region. But again, that's controversial. All we can really say, linguists would say we know what we know based on reconstructions, and that takes us as far back as Proto-Indo-European. Anything beyond that is just speculation.
Yeah, that hypothetical language would have to be pretty far back in time, because the grammars of the two different language families are pretty different, and so is the vocabulary. And yeah, I mean, I've seen some studies of some reconstructed, well, hypothetically reconstructed cognates, but nothing extremely definitive.
Proto-Uralic was spoken in the northern steppe region at the same time that Proto Indo-European was probably spoken in the southern steppe region. And that was one of the factors that helped linguists to try to place it in the steppe region as opposed to Anatolia, is because there were some historical connections between those two language families. And it was thought that Proto Indo-European, whoever they were at the time, they didn't know it was the Yamnaya necessarily, but they must have lived relatively close to the Proto-Uralic speakers. And there are some links, but they are still distinct families.
Right, right. Okay, this one is for you, Kevin. Do you have a historical date at which you plan to end your podcast?
I guess whatever the date I prepare, my last podcast, I mean, whatever that date is, whenever I catch up to that time. Here's the thing. I don't really have an answer to that because I don't really think that far ahead, but I am going to try to take it into the 20th century. The podcast is going to evolve a bit once I get beyond the great vowel shifts, because up until now, it's been I've been able to weave together political and social, cultural, and linguistic events and develop a theme and kind of approach it that way. But after we get into the 1500s and certainly into the 1600s, we're going to have too much going on. We're going to have English spreading around the world. So we'll have English, increasingly in Ireland. We'll have it in North America, eventually in India. So it's just going to make it more difficult. So it's going to become, as I envision it, more of a chronological podcast, trying to trace it out in segments of time, what was happening. And right now, my goal is to take it as all the way up into the 21st century, I suppose.
Okay, next question. Did other Indo-European language branches like Celtic, Italic, Germanic, etc., continue to evolve from descendants of the Yamnaya Proto-Indo-European speakers or from each other? Do they share parent languages or grandparent languages?
Well, that's a matter of some debate. I do think that there is a commonly held theory that the Celtic languages and the Italic languages, so that includes Latin, probably originated from the same branch. So that one time there was a migration of speakers that then later separated and formed those two distinct branches. And that's due to some linguistic similarities and the fact that the early Celts lived in south central Europe, kind of north of where the Italic speakers lived. So that's a possibility, but again, it's difficult to say for certain. The Baltic and Slavic languages, it's generally agreed that they were originally one language family that split. That's why they're sometimes called the Balto-Slavic languages. And the languages of northern India and Iran probably emerged, or initially were one language that split. That's why it's sometimes called the Indo-Iranian branch. But as far as we know beyond that, it appears that the Germanic languages were distinct, not really evolving out of another language family. Though the Germanic languages, they have a lot of root words that come from somewhere else. When you look at the core vocabulary of a language, the words we tend to use most often that we learn as small children, those tend to be the oldest words in the language and tend to be the ones that go all the way back to the Proto Indo-Europeans. But in the Germanic languages, we have a lot of words in the core vocabulary that come from somewhere else. So it appears that there was a mixing in Northern Europe between the Proto Indo-Europeans and some other group. And that's a matter of some debate as well.
Yeah, I'm not recalling the exact connections right now, but there are some ideas in the scholarship that Greek at some point may have like split off from Indo-Iranian. Do you know anything about that off the top of your head?
I don't know about that, but there's a tremendous amount of dispute still about the Anatolian languages,
right?
And that provides that connection there. And again, I won't get into all the details, but I mentioned Hittite as being the first branch or descendant of the Indo-European languages, but there are a lot of people who argue that it's a sister language, and that's a debate for another day. But yeah,
I think DNA and archaeology aside, I think that, and we have 30 seconds left, so we can't really get into this now, but there's also a fair amount of linguistic evidence to indicate that the Indo-European languages in Anatolia were intrusive upon earlier populations, non-Indo-European populations. All right, well, that's it for this talk. I had a great time. I hope you all did. Thank you, Kevin, for agreeing to do this with me.
Absolutely. Enjoyed it. Thanks, Ray. Bye.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.
Yes, thank you. I'll see you all at another talk that I'll be adminning for. Take care, everybody.
All right.